Good evening and welcome once again to Plain Talk. Thank you for joining me. Tomorrow, Thursday, May 11th, two eminent academics will be launching a book, Indo-Caribbean Feminist Thought, at the University of Guyana. In fact, a couple of days later, they'll be going to the Tain campus to do the same exercise. Tonight, it is my pleasure to have as guests on Plain Talk the editors of the book, Dr. Gabrielle Hussein, head of the Institute of Gender and Development Studies of the University of the West Indies, and Dr. Lisa Outar, Guyanese scholar living in the United States. Welcome to Guyana. Welcome back to Guyana.
Thank you for having us.
Hope you're having a great time. This book, very interesting subject, interesting title. Indo-Caribbean Feminist Thought. What in fact, or who is the Indo-Caribbean, and how does one define Indo-Caribbean feminist?
Well, I'll start with the part that we recognize that not everybody uses this term Indo-Caribbean to describe themselves, right? So, for example, in Guyana, I probably had never heard anybody call themselves an Indo-Caribbean. But we
I think that's correct.
Right.
Yeah.
And even within the diaspora, I think there, tend to be lines that are drawn along nationality more so. We have in our scholarship and in our approaches, our activism, our approaches to thinking about the Caribbean, we have a real dedication to an idea of regionality. And so for us, the emphasis on that Caribbean part is to think across national boundaries and to be able to think about commonalities for experiences of women of Indian descent and also mixed race women, Dogla women, across borders in a way that's linked more to a history of indentureship than to the history of indentureship than rather to just, what's specific to Guyana. But we, again, I think we also embody working across the divide, since Gabrielle is based in Trinidad and I'm from Guyana but based in the diaspora. So we're trying to put into conversation a lot of different types of experiences.
Gabrielle?
Indo-Caribbean feminist thought. What is it? It's really the way that women in the Caribbean draw on the struggles, negotiations, and legacies that have been handed down to us through the indentureship experience. We have to keep in mind that our foremothers, when they came on ships, and with all that they were negotiating in plantation life, aspirations for themselves, control over money, what they wanted for their children, in all of these things, Indian women were not just negotiating as Indian women. They were also friends and having solidarities with a range of other women in the Caribbean who they might meet in markets, who they might meet in school, who they might meet in religious spaces. So when we say Indo-Caribbean feminist thought, while we're talking about what we've gotten from our foremothers, we see our foremothers as firmly grounded in a Caribbean experience that for us many different kinds of women and men have contributed to.
Interesting. But I've had the privilege of not reading as well as I would have liked. But there's Jihadjanhood, I think is mentioned, the sisterhood that developed as people crossed the Kalapani, terms that we use fairly liberally. So there wasn't that kind of community we're talking about?
It's one aspect of community that we're describing, right? So one of the things that we wanted to do with the book was to track the ways in which women scholars in particular have come up with these terms for trying to think about the kinds of relations that Gabrielle is describing. And again, even within the concept of Jahaji Bahin, the idea is, in fact in the chapter that deals with that in this book by Kavita Singh, it's talking about an inclusive concept of that. So the types of relationships that women were forging with each other are not specific to the ship, but has these reverberations in Caribbean society in the time of indentureship, in the time of post-indentureship, and even out into the diaspora. So what that idea brings us is the rupture that indentureship represented in particular types of relations, especially gender relations, and the reconstitutions that happen within the space of the Caribbean in ways that were including, that worked across gender and across race and class. And so we're particularly interested in those new constructions.
Dr. Gabriel?
The thing is that amongst the young generation of women, this generation of women, you know, we have worked hard, our foreparents have worked hard, our Caribbean foreparents, not just our lineage, you know, have worked hard to give women of this generation the sense that it's our right to choose the kinds of lives that we would like, the lives that are best for us in terms of educational aspiration, in terms of jobs, in terms of dreams, you know, for what you want to achieve. And Indo-Caribbean feminist thought is basically trying to name the fact that these aspirations have always existed in Indian women's lives, and that we've drawn on many, many sources of knowledge and strength in order to pursue them.
I wonder if you could give us a quick 30 seconds overview of this book. A series of articles or essays. I wonder.
You want to?
Well, we can kind of complete each other, but we framed it. Our introduction, for example, is doing a kind of work, and so part of what we wanted to do was to think about scholarship, right? What are the books? What are the ideas that have been in existence for over 30 years now? A trend within, and again, we see Indo-Caribbean feminist thought as part of a Caribbean feminist movement, but we didn't see anybody else trying to draw out that, you know, the specificity of that lineage, and that we use the term genealogy, and a term that we tend to use in terms of families, right? But it's also a kind of way of tracking a set of ideas that, in fact, we've noticed has been very influential for younger scholars, especially. So terms like Kalapani poetics and Douglas poetics, Matikor and Bindi, the way that Roseanne Kanai has used them, and so on. So in our introduction, that's part of what we're doing is tracking that that scholarly lineage. The chapters themselves are by people who are engaging with a whole bunch of different ways in which that feminist thinking has played out in places like education, for example. So we have lots to say about education, in part because we see it as this
space for empowerment?
Space for empowerment, space for aspiration, and a space that in fact kind of challenges maybe some of your preconceptions about what a feminist might look like, right? So one of the things that we...
No comments.
Well, we're feminists, right?
And what a feminist looks like.
This is what feminism looks like. We know men who are feminists.
This is what a feminist looks like too.
Exactly. So we have chapters, the education aspect, for example, we really wanted to highlight the fact that indentured women and the generations that followed, their daughters and so on, and their granddaughters, have always worked, you know, their fingers sometimes literally to the bone to be able to save for their children, their daughters, and their sons' education. And education in the region, and especially we look at the ways in which Christian education, Hindu schools, Muslim schools, and so on have all been these spaces that have opened up possibilities for women's agency, right? And so whether it's a matter of being able to get enough money together to send your child to school, that becomes a feminist aspiration that then a subsequent generation can use to invent themselves in less confined ways in a society.
Before I bring Dr. Hussain in, is it Hussain or Hussain?
Either.
Hussain.
How has the absence of the written word by the early generations affected learning and thought?
That's a great question.
Yes.
I really enjoy that question, because part of what is difficult is to find the traces of our foremothers, as Gabrielle has said. And again, I want to emphasize our understanding of foremothers and this genealogy is one that is inclusive of all the people that would have been in these Caribbean spaces at the time that these identities were being shaped, right? So we see continually, my field is literature. I'm a specialist in Caribbean literature, and in particular in Indo-Caribbean literature. And so what we see in this in Caribbean writers continually, like Ramabai Binet, and so many of them, is an attempt to...
That's from which country?
Trinidadian.
Mahadai Das, is
Mahadai
cited quite a lot
Das,
in
Rajkumari
the book.
Singh.
Those are Guyanese.
These
Yes.
are Guyanese writers.
Yes.
Ryan Shaw, who I talk about in my chapter in the book. Almost all of these, right, Lakshmi Prasad, so on and so forth, are all trying in some ways to give voice to that generation that was unable to
Gayatri did the same kind of...
Gayatri did the same thing for
Absolutely.
herself.
Yeah.
Absolutely. So, but one of the things that they also, all of them, are capture, and one of the things that I'm interested in my own work is to understand that there are multiple ways of telling this story, right? So this book also offers multiple ways of telling the story of how Indo-Caribbean feminism comes into being, and orality is a really important aspect, and visuality is an
Yes.
important aspect, right? So we have pieces on art, for example, here, but orality, for example, in Ryan Shaw's novel that I talk about comes in dreams and in songs and in ways in which the legacy of ancestors who would never have been able to sit down and write a book about their experiences, but that those memories carry down in other forms to subsequent generations.
You know what we're hoping that this book inspires? This book is really meant for, amongst others, students at our universities in the Caribbean. When our own Caribbean students go to university and they have to cite theories, you know, we have to get theories from places that don't know about us and have not included us in their thinking about theories. And so we also want this book to be a resource for Caribbean students in University of Guyana and University of the West Indies, who can see that theory can be produced from within the region. And theory, yes, it might have some big words, right? But you'll also see words you recognize. You'll also hear stories,
Yes.
whether it's about Matikor or whether it's about Bindi. You will also hear stories.
Crab moving forward sideways.
Yes,
Exactly.
that you also recognize, and that's important. It's important to know that we can be scholars, you know, and Guyana has a long history of producing incredible scholars.
I think the region has.
The region, and so that's important for us too. It's important for us to be able to claim the space of academia and say, you know, we don't need to necessarily cite all these people. We can write the books that we can cite ourselves. That's the first thing. The second thing that we wanted to do in this book, and that's why the word feminist is in it, is to acknowledge how much us as a generation and a generation that's coming after us has really benefited from the feminist movement in the region and the ways that they introduced a lot of ideas to the region that took a long time for people to discuss and get used to. Those ideas about, you know, negotiating power, or ideas about challenging silence, or about sexuality and ending homophobia. That's the trajectory. That it's those feminist women that have created the space for us to create a kind of collection. And so really we are, in our own way, as academics, trying to take their feminist, the paths that they have created into a generation who can think about this through books that exist today.
So is this about establishing and occupying the space of the Indo-Caribbean in this general regional feminist architecture?
It is, in a certain sense. It is about identifying and naming, right? So naming this tradition, but it's also at the same time understanding it as having always had been and continues to be in conversation with broader Caribbean feminism. So yes, we are naming. We're describing the contours of this lineage that Gabriella is describing, but at the same time, we're not setting ourselves up as gatekeepers and definers of what this is. So the other really important part of this, so Gabriella is pointing out the part of us paying homage to an earlier generation of feminist scholars who, in fact, were not putting up on a dais and not allowing them to speak. They're included in the book, right? So we have people who are like Patricia Mohammed and Rhoda Reddick especially, who are reflecting on what their journeys have been and what, and who I think all of us as academics, as people, as artists and so on, don't stay in one position in our thinking throughout our careers, right? So it was particularly exciting and interesting to see them think about where they are now compared to when they were forming ideas that were incredibly influential to people, like us now and others after us who are still reading and thinking through those concepts. So we're doing that. We're giving them space to talk, but we're also, it was important to us to mentor new scholarship and people who are coming up. And so you'll find a lot of those voices as well, who we don't really know where they're going to be taking these ideas. And we love that. And in fact, the reason we want to put this out into the world is to see where else it takes us. So the other thing that Gabrielle and I were very wanted to point out is that we are part of a larger the Caribbean is part of a larger indentureship experience, and so we have this image of this boat in the book on the
which I find interesting. The boat is going outwards.
Yes,
it's important.
Yes,
it's important that the boat is going outwards. It's a wonderful image by a Trinidadian photographer, Nyla Singh, and we're very grateful to have her beautiful work gracing the cover. And the boat is pointing outwards because we wanted to make connections in other parts of the indentureship diaspora. I talk about Mauritius specifically in my chapter, but we're also thinking about places like Fiji or Sri Lanka, where Patricia Mohammed just was with a bunch of other feminists talking about, the topics and the issues that tie us and the trials and conditions for women's lives in these spaces.
Yeah, it's important for us to, I think in this book, claim being Indian in the Caribbean, but as much as we do that, to insist that you being Indian doesn't mean you have to be stereotypical, whatever that means in terms of expectations, nor does it mean that you exist outside of the wider Caribbean, where multi-ethnic relations are what makes this region so special, and that long history of multi-ethnic solidarities, particularly in Guyana and in Trinidad, is crucial and something that we really prioritize as part of claiming that identity.
Yet the book refers to continual encounters with the express fear of co-option into an Indian cultural nationalist and political agenda, or remaining trapped within identity politics, as reflecting a distrust of Indo-Caribbean feminist thought, and does accurately reflect decades of its politics. Where do the expressions of fear come from, and how do you respond to those fears?
Good questions.
That's good questions, right? So I was saying to Gabrielle,
I'm not subject to flattery.
that part of what, anybody writes a book. People pick it up, they look at it, do they like the cover, do they like the title? And it is a concern that somebody would look at this book and see Indo-Caribbean feminist thought and think, oh, they're just, being separate, creating some kind of separate but equal feminism. That is entirely wrong. And, if you open the book and read the introduction, you would know very quickly that that's not the kind of approach that we have. But, we're realists. We're from the region. We live in the region. I'm in the region often. And we understand the political landscape in which we exist. And so I think that there is, certainly a strand of thinking about Indian identity within culturally purist terms, and especially, I think, as women, Indian femininity is something that is incredibly policed from a lot of different people and groups, right? So how you can be an Indian woman is something that you're continually being told by other people. So I think one of the things when we're talking about fears, we want to make sure it's clear that when we're staking and claiming this ground of Indo-Caribbean feminist thought, that we're not claiming a ground of an exclusionary ground, a ground that says that only certain type of people can produce Indo-Caribbean feminist thought, because in fact, if you notice in the book, it's not just Indian women producing that scholarship. And it's also important for us to point out that the stereotypes, as Gabrielle is saying, again, there's so many and they're so silly in so many ways. But, you know, an Indian woman, for example, I am a Christian Indo-Guyanese, right? And I come from a family with Muslims and Hindus. And, you know, and you don't have to be straight to be an Indo-Caribbean woman. You don't have to, you know, you don't have to be purely Indian to be a part of this intellectual trajectory. So those are some of the things that we were referencing in the comment that you read.
Yes, you know, the fears of what women do come from all sides. You know, once women are deciding things for themselves, somebody is potentially afraid.
Regardless of whether they're Indian or anybody.
And the thing is that on the one hand, well, I can speak for Trinidad, for example, there's this idea that for Indian women to be properly Caribbean, they must be creolized in particular ways, you know, or to be properly Caribbean means to be less Indian. At the same time, there's this idea that Indian women must be Indian in ways that are respectable and appropriate and heterosexual and make round roti and other things, right? And we're resisting all of those. We're resisting all demands on Indian women that decide for us what being from the region, empowered, at home, and in solidarity and with strong relations of trust and intimacy with others, not just Indian men, but non-Indian men, non-Indian women, mixed persons, our neighbors, our, you know, the people we're in school with, the people we do school bazaars with, that being from the Caribbean for Indian women is about those multiple kinds of relations. And so we're resisting any fears around what we're deciding to do for ourselves and saying, in fact, the long tradition of our foremothers, whether Indian or African, as Lisa is saying, is to try and create lives that feel fulfilling and that have meaning, and that those require that you be supported and empowered to do so.
Now, each chapter is not each of the, you call them chapters or
chapters.
They're written by different writers. Right? I don't expect you to either understand what goes into the thinking or to even subscribe to everything that is said. But within the subsets of Indo-Caribbean groups, you would have had people differing by caste, religion, ethnicities, or as it's put in the book, multiple, ambiguous, ambivalent, and cross-pollinated. So that you've got so many groups as there are across the entire region. How does this book seek to capture the multiple, ambiguous, the ambivalent, cross-pollinated that make up the Indo-Caribbean feminists?
We tried to aim for some regional diversity. So there are pieces that come from people are talking about realities in Guyana, realities in Trinidad, realities in New York, realities in Mauritius. We're just Guadeloupe. So first of all, we're trying to go for kind of regional differences. Secondly, we want to recognize that even if you may be Hindu, right? Or let me speak for Trinidad. In Trinidad, even if somebody may be Muslim, chances are for Diwali they're going by their neighbor for food or something on Diwali, and same for Eid. So even if you are one identity, right, that's not the entire, being Muslim or being Indian or being, it's not the entirety of who you are as a person. So even if we're talking about specific groups, we have to remember these are not people living single identity lives. Right. And thirdly, we have tried in different ways to look at art, look at literature, cite references to music and different kinds of cultural traditions. One thing that I would say, and also to reference some different kinds of activist histories also. One thing, it's hard to get a span, like an ethnic span of everybody, and one can't realistically aim to do that. But I think we did try and aim for the kinds of identities and traditions in their diversity that inspire people, including things like carnival.
But it's still mainly Trinidad and Guyana?
Well, we have, yes. So that's part of the limitations of Indo-Caribbean studies as it stands now, right?
Yes.
Most of the scholarship that circulates is from Trinidad and Guyana. And it's
And their diasporas.
And their diaspora. So in part of it is a question of numbers, right? These are the societies that have the largest numbers. So we worked quite hard, in fact, to include perspectives from the diaspora, from Guadeloupe and from Martinique. And as I said, this kind of thinking for me, Mauritius bringing in a broader post-indentureship range. However, we still, and again, for us, this is kind of a start on a journey, right? So we continue to work together. I don't know if we'll ever stop. Hopefully not. I enjoy it. But we'd love to hear more from Suriname, for example, and Jamaica, and throughout the region, but also from all these other places that I'm mentioning where indentureship spread to. So there is continually more perspectives that we can include, but this is a start at thinking about a tradition that is here, that is doing very important work that we think that needs to be identified, and that we hope other people, including younger scholars, will take up.
And there are going to be gaps in everything
Sure.
that you produce. And so we're hoping, for example, that any book that comes after this focuses a lot more on movements, documenting movements. We really documented individual lives and stories and inspiration. So, and also features much more on Muslim women and Indian Muslim women in the region than we were able to do.
This other gap, you have the OECS countries, and I noticed one of the writers spoke of the Grenada Revolution and the Caribbean Present, Operation Origin Memory, the conflicting cultural memories. So there are some. They're not large, except I think in Jamaica you have a fairly significant Indian population.
Yes, but we had to draw on those people who are doing that work already.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So what it is that we were able to capture quite a bit of the work that's currently being done. There are already, since this book has been in production, there are already PhD students that are coming in who are working on areas that may not have been covered. Masculinities and cricket might be one area, and some others. Labor history, where a bit like what Gaitra writes about, but maybe focusing more on some other issues. And so this is a recognition of where the work is, the field is at this stage, and I think where it needs to go.
I mean, we would love to actually mentor each student in the areas where we think they need to, there are gaps and that need to be worked out. But there are, as Gabrielle is saying, there's some very interesting dissertations and projects that are being shaped. I've been thinking especially about Gillian Olivier's Fernandez's work. She's talking in Trinidad about the way in which Muslim women are adopting religious wear and in their own very distinct fashion, and thinking about the kind of global politics around that, right? So there are all of these spaces that I think people would be interested in and recognize as being part of the landscape that Caribbean peoples negotiate in their everyday lives. And of course, Indian women are not the only people that wear Indian wear in the Caribbean, right?
Yeah.
So these are also just spaces for further spaces for
We welcome future work, and hope that this book stimulates in its gaps and limitations, stimulates some of that.
Well, hopefully, too, the work that you do at the University of the West Indies, and the fact that this book is being also launched, is it considered a launch tomorrow at the University of Guyana?
It is a launch at the
Yes,
University of
because
Guyana, and then the next night on the Tain campus.
Because I think the state and its agencies, the universities, have a duty to be able to push this. The other thing I thought the books like Ryan Shaw, Weaving Water, should, and I'm sure there are lots of others, but I'm very familiar with that one. Shouldn't we be getting those books on the syllabuses of the regional examinations?
I haven't read Reading Water. I've read A Silent Life, and I personally found A Silent Life is one of the incredibly powerful book. It's never left me, and I'll tell you why. There's a story that she tells in A Silent Life of the grandmother in the 1930s who's a sugar worker. But she's educated by the pundit who lives down the road, and the pundit teaches her to read using Marxist pamphlets. And it just would never occur to anybody, because we have these stereotypes of Indian women, sugar workers, who are not literate in the 1930s. It would never occur to you that the Hindu pundit might have been using Marxist tracts that he got, right, to educate the sugar worker grandmother in the 1930s. And I just love the way that a book like that makes us question our notion of women in history and maybe look beyond the stereotypes that we may have today.
But the question is, shouldn't books like those be on our, maybe it should be
I absolutely
reading? Yeah, we would agree, yes.
I mean, again, as somebody who looks closely at the literature that comes out of the region, I think literature has this incredible power, right? It tells stories, and people connect to stories, and you can enter into the life of a character and understand somebody, especially a perspective that's quite different from yours. Literature allows that. Film allows that as well. There are different kinds of languages for telling these stories. And I think it's also important to recognize yourself in literature, right? So the stories that we teach our children in school should recognize the diversity of groups and faces and experiences that are present within the region, and they should inspire people to be able to imagine a different future for themselves, right? So I think one of the things I like about A Silent Life, and I like about a lot of the women writers that I've named and that I study and look at, is that they imagine within their work the kind of world that they would like to see. So, for example, a Caribbean that is not riven by ethnic strife, that has politicians that are held accountable.
That's not homophobic.
That's not homophobic. That is not, that is not swept by commodity pleasures, and that is, and that's environmentally conscious and so on. So, writers can lead us.
Or where there's no violence against women.
Exactly. So writers can really lead us in imagining a different future, and the more young people that can read those visions, the more they can imagine that those are possible.
But just even if it's not on the list, and I want to say something about this book, which is that we have made sure at the two launches to donate copies of this book to a number of places,
including the National Library, the National Archives, and community centers in Berbice and here in Georgetown, so that young people can get their hands on this. We understand that it is a theoretical book, and that it and again it depends on which chapter you open to.
Yes.
But it won't be accessible for everybody. But it's a moment at least that people can recognize that some of the complexities of their lives is being reflected in academia, in scholarship, and that they can use that in whatever way that they.
This is it, and so we want to invite your viewers to know that at the public library and at the National Archives and so on, that they can go and read this book. So even if you can't buy it, it's publicly accessible, and for us that was important.
And at some point in the near future, you mentioned you've been talking with Austin's bookstore, which is probably our leading bookstore.
Right.
Yes,
probably the only bookstore we haven't had.
We're
Tragically.
in such support of independent bookstores. So I was speaking with Mr. Austin this morning, and I am horrified to hear that there are actually bookstores that make their living based on selling photocopies of books, right? So those people should be absolutely ashamed of themselves, and we should support our independent bookstores as much as we can. So this book is also going to be coming out in soft cover at some point down the line, so we will make sure lots of copies are there.
Let Mr. Austin know if you want a copy.
Absolutely.
Now, how does this book capture the dual consciousness which has confronted the Indian person from day to day?
Right.
Hindu and Muslim by birth and conviction.
Yeah.
and I think we've got examples. But Western religions and social mores practically dominating and dictating for us, dominating and dictating to say, look, you Lal Bashanram, you could not get a job unless you became a Christian, which is what happened to me. So I suddenly became Christopher Ram.
And there's a legacy.
How does the book describe, if at all?
And there's a legacy of having to, change your religion to be able to be educated, for example. So I think I would move outside of the idea of a dual consciousness, because I think there are actually many more positionalities that Indians in the Caribbean are expected to traverse, and maybe perhaps even more so for if you're a mixed race, right? Because there are all of these, as you say, social mores that are like a minefield for you to have to negotiate. I think what the book is highlighting, in fact, is that you can be. There's a fancy big term, intersectionality, that people use in feminist discourse in the U.S. especially all the time now. But what it boils down to is that no one person is living a single issue life, right? There are some times where your gender is what needs to be negotiated most. There are other times where it's your sexuality. There are other times where it's your class, and often you're having to negotiate all of those things at the same time. And so I think the diversity of perspectives that we're offering here is suggesting that even if you think of yourself as a relatively simple person, and you're defined by your job or your church or whatever it is, there's a lot more that roads that you're traversing, especially as a woman, and especially if you're doing it with not just your own future in mind, but the future of your children.
It's good to keep in mind for women, too, that whether it was westernization or tradition, both of those had empowering elements as much as they had oppressive elements. So it's not even a dual consciousness, because women were constantly negotiating demands on all sides and were drawing on whatever resources that they could find to create the lives for themselves and for their children that they wanted. So for me, it's not even the dual consciousness. It's to look at how women are drawing from whatever resources are available to them, including other women of different kinds, and to try and focus on telling those kinds of stories.
The other area that's important, just to point this out quickly, is religion, which sometimes, when people talk about feminism or talk about Indianness, it's associated with a particular religious tradition. So we also are pointing out in the book how Indian women have negotiated Christianity, situations where the only options that were available to you, for example, in Guyana and in Trinidad especially, would have been a Canadian Mission Presbyterian school, right? Yes. But those spaces became spaces in which Indian women could assert their right to an education, could use that education to further their identities as Indian women in their community. So I don't know if you know this autobiography that Anna Mahace, who was a Trinidadian writer, called My Mother's Daughter. It's a wonderful book that she started writing in the 1930s and actually didn't complete until the 1960s, in part because, women weren't expected to be writers. But one of the things that she talks about is that the Canadian mission schools that she was educated in expected her to give up her Indianness, whether that was her dress or language or so on, in the ways that Gabrielle was talking about, that to be modern, to be Western,
to be accepted,
you needed to remove those markers of ethnic specificity, whatever that specificity would have been, right? Same thing would have been true for African dress or African languages or all of the other cultural traditions that inform these spaces that we're in. She, however, was able to hold her views close to her chest and practice that, use that education in a way that was contrary to what perhaps her teachers would have wanted, right? And then once she graduated, she was able to practice a kind of Hindu, Indian informed Christian education, or model that for her students. So
and
there are all
that's
of
so
these
typical
examples.
for women in the Caribbean, to create that mix of elements that come to define who they are.
One of many challenges that Indian women face.
And women in the Caribbean generally.
Now, You mentioned about writers a minute ago. We've had a fair share of homegrown writers, artists, academics, but they're more prominent names. I mean, if you talk to the two Nobel writers, they went to the diaspora. Is that the same kind of challenge? You, Dr. Hussain, you've lived your life in the Caribbean. Where did you do your postgraduate and your PhD?
My PhD I did in London, but my other graduate degree I did at the University of the West Indies at the Institute for Gender and Development Studies, where I still am 20 years later.
Wow.
And in fact, that's something you see. This is it. The more we produce the scholarship that stays with you at home, right? The more scholars are doing this work, is the less you can draw on what's in our own spaces. And for me, the Institute for Gender Studies, where I am in Trinidad, which exists on the other campuses, is a good example of, I think, that what we give you is better than what you could get in many, many other places. And so we want to encourage us to build our own universities and places of learning as places that you could find yourself as a scholar, as a writer, as an artist, as a poet, and so on.
Well, let me ask you, of the contributors to this publication, how many of them are resident in the Caribbean?
About 6 or 7, maybe 8.
And I think you've got 15? 15.
Yeah.
Something like that. Not bad, I guess.
And some travel back and forth, and some are have never lived in the Caribbean at all, but their parents are from the Caribbean, and so they have an interesting story to tell also.
I think it's important to think about the fact that this is not just a story about the region bounded by place, by its physical borders, but that the diaspora is also an important part of understanding Indo-Caribbean identity and history, because it continues to unfurl in spaces like New York and Toronto and London and Paris if you're from the Francophone Caribbean and so on. And so what we didn't have a kind of regional diaspora divide, because these ideas are continually crossing borders, right? So
and waters.
Yes.
So one of the
which is very much part of us, isn't it?
Yeah. So one I really particularly find suggestive. There's a chapter in the book written by Stephanie Jackson, who's a graduate student who may have graduated.
Not Caribbean at all.
Not Caribbean at all. But she is doing ethnographic work with Indo-Guyanese women in New York, and their involvement with ecstatic religious communities, especially for what I know in Guyana as Kalimai churches, but is Mariaman. So Mariaman traditions in New York. And so she's going into these spaces in Queens, especially, where Indo-Caribbean culture is alive and well. And so people are bringing all of these histories that have shaped them in the region to these spaces in Queens, and creating something that is both consistent with what they know at home, but also entirely new. And what's interesting for Stephanie and for us is also the ways in which those spaces, as rich with the possibility for reinvention, they're also places that are very policed for how you could be an Indian woman in that space, right? So you're not supposed to, your body is not supposed to do certain things within that space. And so I think that's great that her perspectives and that diasporic perspective is included as part of this narrative.
Dr. Hussain, Patricia Mohammed in the book argued that Indo-Trinidadian women colluded with attempts to re-establish the classic patriarchy. How does Indo-Caribbean feminist thought confront what I think is an unbroken lineage, despite the very commendable number of examples? And I think we sometimes forget that 1/3, or rather 2/3 of the women who were indentured were actually single to Guyana. Now, how does Indo-Caribbean feminist thought deal with this issue of the patriarchal lineage and dominance?
So Patricia Muhammad is writing about the post-indentureship period, so
Yes.
right when indentureship ends in 1917.
Yes.
And village life is being established now off the plantation.
That's the last vote, right? 1917.
1917 was when indentureship was finally abolished.
Okay.
By India.
Yeah.
Mhm.
And
But I think no. The point I was making, and they're not that there
The
were still people.
contracts,
Who,
yes.
it went beyond 1917.
yes, the contracts would have probably gone on beyond.
I think it went to 1920.
Yeah.
Yes, the
So-
last one.
But the system was abolished. in
Yes,
Yeah.
that's correct. Yeah.
And in what she's trying to say is that because even though women came individually, not as wives but as workers,
Mhm.
in the course of making a new and alien society home, they also formed strong community bonds with the men who came also as indentured workers. And so in many ways supporting their kinfolk, finding cultural community and other forms of continuity, created not their desire for solace, created this way of colluding with patriarchy, right?
Mhm.
Now, today I would argue that it's a little bit, the options are much wider.
Mhm.
All women and men navigate patriarchy as it is, right? It's the world we live in, just and it's one in which we try to find spaces of empowerment and freedom and ways to challenge, but which we have not entirely overcome at all. And I would argue that whereas Patricia Muhammad is focusing on women colluding while also negotiating with patriarchy 100 years ago, now we would want to talk about how women are navigating the options available to them, which those options may be around education, employment, a career in politics, for example, but they're also around marriage, family, and sexuality, right? And so my argument would be that all of those options were not as available to women as they are now. So instead of trying to negotiate narrower expectations, women are now navigating a whole range of contradictory expectations, and that provides a much wider terrain for, like, you know, we were talking about this even on the way here. As Indian women, we're able to draw on tradition, on modernity, on culture, on all kinds of things in ways that might not have been available to us before. And so even though the collusions do remain, and they are ones that I think today are being reworked in far more diverse ways than they could have been 100 years ago, and paying attention to that diversity is important.
But based on the statistics, and I'm merely quoting, I think it's McNeil and Lau. I got this from this book. If Indian women, 2/3 of, they wouldn't have been large by overall numbers, but they took this conscious decision. That shows courage, it shows enterprise, it shows independence. How did the Indian woman fall into this stereotypical
Right.
box?
So I think that's also some of what Patricia Muhammad's work helps us to understand when she's looking at what happens after people arrive here, right? The community arrives. So you're absolutely right. The nice word the word I like to use to describe that generation of women who would have gotten on the ships are unruly, right? They would have been, some of them sex workers, some of them widows. All of them would have been in categories that would have been considered problematic or undesirable in some way in India, on the subcontinent, right? And they come and they forge all kinds of new relationships that allow them to make a living. They would choose which mate. They may have more than one mate at the same time.
They were earning an income.
They were workers. The whole public-private divide is really troubled by this. They were not in the house. They were out in the fields, which also made them incredibly vulnerable to violence and to sexual exploitation and abuse, right? So they made these choices under great danger to themselves. One of the things that Patricia Muhammad's work and Rhoda Reddock's as well does is to track the ways in which once indentureship ended And Indians, the idea of returning to the subcontinent became less and less of a reality. Once there started to be a community building effort within the region, what happened, and which happens in other instances too, is that there became a moment where there had to be a reinstatement of a particular type of order.
And tradition.
And tradition. And as happens again in other cultures and societies, women's bodies had to be policed and narrated in a particular way to produce that coherence of a cultural identity. The thing that we point out, and Patricia, Pat Muhammad does as well, is that patriarchy is also oppressive for men, right?
Mm-hmm.
So we're very happy to have a whole section on this book that's on Indo-Caribbean masculinities as well. So women are not the only ones that are subject to control and to oppressive ideas under patriarchal norms. And there are all sorts of ways in which older generation of Indo-Caribbean men, and especially younger generations, are negotiating and navigating in similar ways that Gab is describing. So, for example, in Chutney, we know that there is a tradition of rum songs, right? Rum songs which celebrate...
I'm going to ask you about that in 2 minutes.
All right. Well, you're welcome to ask me about it now if you'd like, but, there's a way in which people have to... Why don't you ask
let me ask you about it.
Ask me, and then we'll go from there.
This whole genre of chutney music, that really seems to objectify women and Indian womanhood. A recent one being, it was drawn to my attention, I'm not big into music, being this Ram Singh Sharma from Sawa.
Ram Singh Sharma.
Now, do you have views? What are your views on whether that hurts or is absolutely irrelevant to feminism in any form?
Ram Singh Sharma, for your listeners, village Ram from Sawa. So what he is the classic dominant man who must have plenty woman, right?
No, but he's being made into a hero almost.
Right.
We can have our faults personally, but should that be made?
Well,
in
the song, he's actually hurting a number of women. So the wife doesn't know that he's with the sister, right? And it's a lot of very painful scenarios.
Yeah.
And it's a kind of irresponsible manhood that nonetheless gets status from his ability to fool women. And actually, Patricia Muhammad's own work in her writing on Calypsos talks about the kind of man who has the capacity to fool up women as having a status, right? And so the women know this about him, but they flock him. And in fact, Ram Singh Sharma is the classic Calypsonian figure, where the Calypsonian in an older period would have women in different villages, and they would all know. But this would be part of his mystique.
My question though,
is it harmful?
Yes.
Yes, I think it's harmful. I mean, I personally wrote a chutney song in response, but didn't get a chance to record it.
You want to sing? You're free to sing it on this program.
And yes, I do think it's harmful, but the Caribbean is facing a moment when women are challenging men's power, and so songs like this are also a representation of men trying to assert a sexual dominance of women at a time when it seems that women are apparently taking over in every field. And I just want to say something before we conclude about how did women end up, what happened to lead these autonomous and unruly women to become seen as housewives. Now, we think Indian women were always housewives. We don't think they were adventurers and they didn't like their situation, and then they didn't like this man, so they went to the next one and they were earning their own. What happened? And the truth is, Indian women experienced a lot of violence, as did many women in plantation life. And that violence came from colonial authorities. It came from their own men. It came from colonial planters who were controlling plantation life from overseers. And so we always have to remember, and that's the same reality today, that violence, right, extreme amounts of violence are what keep women in context where they are seen as docile and domesticated instead of as autonomous and in control of their lives. And Gayatri Bahadur traces that story quite well. I don't know if you want to add anything else about the chutney.
Yeah, because what I want to say is that it's a...
She's Guyanese, so she wouldn't.
Yeah.
There's a question. Well, there are Guyanese chutneys that are being produced that follow the same tradition.
In particularly North America, I think.
Yes, exactly. So it's part of what I was saying earlier about a way in which men are working out, people are working out their Indo-Caribbean identities in the diaspora. So one of the ways in which they're choosing to do it is through this medium of rum, which has these ties to this plantation violence and legacy that Gabrielle is referencing. And so it's deeply problematic that you have these young men, 19, early 20s and so on, that are proudly using rum, this thing that's so suggestive of a deeper history, in a ways that's completely unaware of that history. But it's also a way of claiming public space, right? And so I think one of the ways that the book I'm interested in, and my parts of thinking that went into this is in public spaces. Gabrielle thinks about this all the time, because women and men are still very much policed in public spaces. So, what does it mean to be a woman whining to chutney out on the street? Or what does it mean to be a woman to participate in carnival and so on, especially when you've got these stereotypes around us. So I think one of the things that I want to maybe wrap up with is to think about the stakes.
I've got a couple more questions.
Okay, but just before we finish, I want to make sure I say the stakes for thinking through these things are not just intellectual. There are real life stakes for how
let me ask you this question.
Can occupy public
let me ask you
spaces in the region.
How do you translate this scholarship into everyday life and touch ordinary people?
We're teachers and we're mentors, right?
Yes.
So we see, and even being here with you, we don't see this as something that we've produced and done. It's something that needs to be translated. It's something that needs to be taught. It's something that needs to be made. These ideas need to be made accessible and need to circulate. So that's part of the work that we're committed to continue to do.
I think the work will live on in the way that others use it. When the work also references much that is living, when it references maticores, when it references carnival. So real life is flowing through the book just as much as the book is highlighting negotiations going on in real life and casting you to look at things that you maybe hadn't noticed. So even if you're reading it and you think, I didn't think about that, let me notice that out there. Now, even that is a way that it casts your eye out of the pages and into the Caribbean region.
I must ask you this final question. The operator is insisting that we finish. Would you say from your own experiences, Trinidad particularly, US less, outside of academia, that the Indo-Caribbean feminist is taken seriously by her male counterpart? And if not, is that a broader Caribbean problem? We have just 15 seconds.
Short answer, I would say increasingly yes. Not enough as yet, but we hope that both women and men are committed to Indo-Caribbean and Caribbean communities that are inclusive and just.
I'd say it's in a state of becoming. It's not. There are lots of spaces where women's voices are still not heard enough, but I think we're helping to clear some space, more space for that.
Dr. Gabrielle Jamila Hussain, Dr. Elisa Hotar, thank you so much for coming and playing dog this evening. It's really been a pleasure talking with you. Good luck on your book. Congratulations on your book.
Thank you.
I hope Guyanese society generally can benefit from it, and I have no doubt that they will. Operators and viewers, thank you. Good night, and I'll see you next week.